If you give it a chance, this book will probably blow your mind. Welcome to Mad on Books, where I talk about fantasy mostly, science fiction sometimes, like today, and comics occasionally. Today's book is Lord of Light by Roger Zelazny. And before I get into how excited I am to have just finished this book today, let's look at what it's got. High tech, sort of. Magic, sort of. An alien planet. A human colony, generations after settlement. Mysterious, powerful aliens. Buddha, sort of. Hindu gods, sort of. Demons, sort of. Actual reincarnation, mythological prose, a strange chronology, and a huge span of time. So with older books, I think it's useful to put them in context a little bit. This was the original cover when Lord of Light was published in 1967, so 55 years ago. It was a time where a hell of a lot was going on. And there was a growing interest in the West in Eastern spirituality. A lot of big name people started going over to India and getting Hindu gurus, getting Buddhist gurus, studying, meditating, doing yoga. All of that sort of stuff comes from this period of time, in the West anyway. Lord of Light won the Best Novel Hugo Award for science fiction the year it was published. It was the same year as the Beatles brought out Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. It was the middle of the Vietnam War, and it was also the year of the Summer of Love, so it was peak hippie at the time. And this is a book of its time, definitely. Welcome to a sidebar of complete weirdness. So the book is pretty weird in and of itself, but in 1979, there was a movie project to make a movie of the book. They had a $50 million budget, which is $200 million in today's money. And interestingly, they hired Jack Kirby to do the concept art. If you don't know comics and the history of comics, Jack Kirby is maybe one of the most famous, influential names in Western comics anyway, ever. He was an artist, a writer. He wrote and drew a lot of comics himself. And he's known, for example, for inventing Iron Man, inventing the X-Men, inventing the Hulk, inventing the Fantastic Four, inventing Thor. He is just a legend in comics. And he did the concept art for the movie. He was known for kind of psychedelic, surreal, groovy kind of art, and the concept art for this movie does not disappoint. It's very Jack Kirby. As soon as I saw it, I was like, yes, that's Jack Kirby. That's what his comics looked like. The other part of the movie plan was to build the whole set for the movie as a permanent structure in Colorado and make it a science fiction themed amusement park. Unfortunately, the movie never got made, the whole plan fell through, and it all kind of went away. You would think that was strange enough, but it gets stranger. A year after the movie fell through, the CIA bought the script and Jack Kirby's concept art to use as a cover during the Canadian Caper, which was basically CIA agents going to Tehran undercover as filmmakers to extract 6 of the American hostages during the Iran hostage crisis. And they went in there posing as people who were making a movie called Argo, which is basically just Lord of the Light, the movie, renamed. So they're going in there to theoretically scout locations and things in Iran to make this movie Argo. And history tells us what happens. They got 6, I think, hostages out, and all of that went well. And then, to make it slightly weirder and close the circle, Ben Affleck produced and starred in a movie called Argo, in which he plays one of these CIA agents infiltrating Tehran to get the hostages out, while posing as someone who is trying to make a movie called Argo, which is based on Lord of Light. Reality is stranger than fiction. So the story is interesting and it has an interesting structure. To start with, the protagonist, the main character that we're following, not always, but most of the book, is called Sam. He's introduced like this. His followers called him Mahasamatman and said he was a god. He preferred to drop the Maha and the Atman, however, and called himself Sam. He never claimed to be a god, but then he never claimed not to be a god. So as usual with reviews, I will talk about things that become pretty clear in the first chapter or two. I won't go any further than that because there are a lot of mysteries in this book. But what becomes clear already in the first book is that there are a number of people who are held to be gods, who themselves know that they are not gods. They have what look like magical powers, but they also have high-tech machines. For example, reincarnation is achieved through a machine. And in the first chapter, Sam is beamed down from somewhere and reincarnated in a new body by other gods. And it's clear that they are rebelling against the rest of the gods. There's a system that has made certain people essentially into gods. They've settled on a new planet and there are gods living off at the North Pole, basically. And there are normal people who hold the gods for actual gods. And reincarnation is a common occurrence in society. There's a whole system around it. Normal people can get reincarnated if their karma is judged to be good enough. And Sam and a couple of his friends have decided to rebel against the gods because the gods are limiting humanity. The rest of the planet, every other human on the planet, is basically kept down by rules the gods have decided on. So technology is more or less medieval. The printing press hasn't been invented yet. Eyeglasses haven't been invented yet. Humanity is being kept at this sort of stable, backwards state, and progress is illegal. And this all comes from the gods. So Sam, posing as Buddha, goes amongst the people and starts encouraging people to actually think for themselves. And this results in a large war between the gods and the rebellious gods and the people. I don't know if I've ever talked about this before. I've been a Buddhist for 25 years, 28 years maybe. So I've meditated a lot. I've read a lot of Buddhist teachings. I've thought a lot about the Buddhist teachings. And this book actually has some genuine Buddhist philosophy in it. Hi, it's Next Day Editing Matt. I just wanted to make a point of saying you can totally enjoy this book without knowing anything about Buddhism or Hinduism. I maybe got a little more out of it than some people might because I know Buddhism, but it's absolutely not a requirement. There's nothing in the book that assumes you know anything about any of this stuff. Anyway, back to yesterday, Matt. And this book actually has some genuine Buddhist philosophy in it. There are a couple of points where Sam is giving a sermon and it isn't word for word out of one of the actual traditional Buddhist teachings, but the concepts represented in it are. So there are a lot of these philosophical concepts. It's not overwhelming. If you don't like philosophy, it's not like reading God Emperor of Dune or something. It's just a couple of lectures that Sam gives. But it was fascinating to me because Sam knows he's not the Buddha. He's not even particularly spiritual. He is doing this in order to spark a rebellion. And all of the other gods are Hindu gods. So there's a Kali, there's a Brahma, there's a Vishnu, there's a Krishna, and so on and so forth. All of the rest of the gods come from the Hindu pantheon. And this is also kind of Interestingly, historically accurate, Buddha was raised as a Hindu, and he was looking for a way to get permanent life beyond the up and down of what we normally experience as life. And he was, in that way, he was rebelling against his Hindu upbringing and what his parents expected of him, what his society expected of him, and that kind of thing. It's a really interesting twist in this because it's going through the Buddhist teachings, and the person teaching is actually not really a Buddha and doesn't believe what he's saying. But a number of people benefit from his teachings because they are actually Buddha's teachings. He is reviving them from history. The structure is really interesting. The very first chapter actually takes place near the end of the story. And there's no real indication. There are no dates or anything like that. So it's good if you're going to read it to know this. The first chapter takes place later. Immediately after the first chapter, it kind of goes back to the beginning of the story, where it shows you how things developed, how he started teaching, how the gods changed, how the world changed, how people started supporting him. And it goes sort of step by step through those until you get to the point in the story, which was just after the first chapter. Each chapter is an unclear amount of time jumped forward. I'm pretty sure, if I understood everything correctly, that all the chapters are in chronological order, other than the first one. But there are obviously gaps, and it really gives you the feeling of, like, if you've got a whole bunch of people who are massively powerful and can reincarnate anytime they want, how do they maybe experience time or not really experience time? There are so many extremely interesting philosophical things going on in here. As far as themes, you could say a lot of it is a critique of religion. Christianity also comes in at one point and gets a pretty bad rap in this book. But also the Eastern philosophy is just being used to control people in this book anyway. And I'm not saying that that was the statement that Zelazny was trying to make. I never met him. I never talked to him about it. I don't know. But it makes you think a lot about how religion can be used to control people, but also there is a positive sense of it as well. There are people who are taught by the Buddha in the book who really do achieve enlightenment and really do free themselves from a lot of the suffering that every other human constantly goes through. So it's not just saying spirituality bad, but throughout the entire book, and it's the premise of the entire book, religion is used as a tool by those ruling to keep everyone else under control. There are epic battle scenes, which I kind of didn't expect. A lot of the book is people talking and character development, which is really interesting. But then there are some really, really epic mythological battles. And that is something that may put some people off if they try to read it. Not the battles, but the whole thing, with a few exceptions, is written in a very mythological prose style. So it will say, Kali came with her great clouds of death and faced Krishna or whatever. It's not written in the style we might be used to if we're used to reading fantasy or science fiction, which is also another big point. It's very hard to put this in one or the other. It is obviously a planet that's been colonized. The gods have the ability to call themselves gods and be believably gods through high-tech stuff that backs them up. But everybody on the planet believes it. And some of the gods even, they're so old and they've been doing this for so long that they've started to believe it themselves. So when you have, it reminds me of that Arthur C. Clarke quote that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. There are bits in this which are written in such a way that if you only read that bit, you would say, okay, this is a book with magic in it. And then 2 paragraphs later, something comes up where you're like, oh, okay, it's science fiction. That's a spaceship, and that's a weapon, some sort of high-tech weapon. And then a couple of paragraphs later, you might be back into, well, this actually sounds a lot like magic. So it's really fascinating the way it doesn't really confine itself to one or the other. Some hardcore fans might get pissed off if I say this, but I mean, I've always thought that Star Wars is basically fantasy Western in space. Dune is basically fantasy in space as well. So not really science fiction, not really fantasy, but not really just science fiction either. This book is very, very much like that. And as far as I know, it may have been the first of its kind. I haven't read that widely in this really old, like 60s science fiction, but it blew my mind. It was so interesting. There are so many things going on in it, and it's written from, like I said, from a very mythological kind of a perspective, but we also get a lot of insight into Sam, and Sam is a bit of a trickster. Sam is also, however, probably the most human character in the entire book. He is doing all of this because he really cares about human progress, that he cares about people having some sort of freedom, being able to decide for themselves, and also that everybody should benefit from these amazing technologies that have been developed. And it was quite amazing watching him go through everything he went through to get to the point where they actually maybe win against the gods. I will give this book the highest praise that I can give pretty much any book. I am planning on rereading it already, and I finished it hours ago. I'm not sure when I'll reread it, but it's one of those books, in a way, it kind of reminds me of the Book of the New Sun. It's not nearly as long as the entire Book of the New Sun. It's just, in the edition I have, it's just this. It's not that thick, but it has a lot of things going on and a lot of very subtle suggestions. It's one of those books that if you like figuring a book out rather than being spoon-fed every detail and everything is always 100% clear, it's one of those books that you will love if you're that kind of person. I generally am that kind of person. I like a lot of books that you kind of have to work on. And I know from rereading a few things this year that were also more complex and involved kind of stories, that this is a book that will profit from rereading. If the first time you read it, it's super interesting, but you are maybe having to think a fair bit, like quite consciously, to kind of put things together and connect the big jumps between the chapters and keep track of different characters, because there's a lot of, everybody has a couple of names, which I often kind of struggle with. Like I said at the beginning, Sam is called Buddha, he's called Siddhartha, he's called Tathagata, he's called Mahasamatman, he's called lots of different things. And he, and all of the other gods are basically the same. So Kali is not Kali's real name because it's a person. And Kali's real name comes up, Kali as Kali comes up, other synonyms for aspects of Kali come up. So it's something you kind of have to pay attention to and take maybe slowly. I read this, I don't know, in 2 or 3 days, which is probably quicker than I should have, but I was just hooked and really got into it. But I definitely look forward to rereading it. I always like to talk about the cover, but I don't really want to talk about this cover. The great thing about this cover is I am really, really grateful to Gollancz for doing the Sci-Fi Masterworks series. They're basically just keeping really, really good old science fiction books in print. And that's amazing. But most of their covers look kind of cheap production. They also have a Fantasy Masterworks series, which is also amazing. Like, if you want to know what old fantasy was like, what old science fiction was like, say, before the 70s, before the, I'm not sure where in time their series begins, but it's really the old classics. The people who really were still figuring out what the genre was and could be. These series, sci-fi masterworks and fantasy masterworks, are really, really worth looking at. What I would like to talk briefly about is the original cover. I love the original cover. It is so unbelievably 60s. There's this weird psychedelic pattern going on. And even better than the weird psychedelic pattern, there's this typography down at the bottom, which I just totally love. This is an atmospheric cover. I talk about illustrative versus atmospheric. Illustrative being, it shows you maybe a scene from the book, character from the book. Atmospheric, it creates a mood that belongs to the book or somehow syncs with the book's contents. This one, I think, is a beautiful atmospheric cover. When you zoom in on various bits of it, you can see there are sort of these windows that look like they have flames in them. Life being described as a flame is kind of a visual metaphor that comes up throughout the book in many, many places. So it's not completely, I mean, it's got a little bit of an illustrative feel, but it's definitely an atmospheric thing. It looks like a drug trip, and somehow I could imagine that the book maybe came from a drug trip as well. It's such a, it's a cover with a lot of feeling of the time when it was published. I don't think you could publish a cover like this today. Probably nobody would ever pick it up. It doesn't really tell you straight from the beginning anything about what the book is about. But by this point, Zelazny had already been publishing for 5 years, I think, and was a pretty well-known name in science fiction. So I can imagine a lot of people would have bought anything he published, no matter what the cover looked like. But I just love the sort of the straight up feeling of naivety. Like you couldn't try and publish this cover today, but I totally love it. When I found it, I was like, oh yes, that so suits this book. It's awesome. So as usual, I hope you're doing well, and I hope you keep reading awesome books like maybe Lord of Light, and I will see you next time.